Well, I'm pleased to do this. I was born and raised in Wyoming and Colorado, and after college, I had been a student body president and had realized that due to a lot of teach-ins and the times that I would not be willing to serve in the Vietnam War, but I wasn't a pacifist on the basis of faith, but of I would have certainly, I think, have fought in World War II and other issues. But I was wrestling with the issue of my orientation to the question of war. Denver had the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons production plant. We had the Rocky Flats arsenal that was producing napalm and Agent Orange and all sorts of chemical and biological weapons. So it was a place in which addressing these issues had a local and neighborhood just as well as a national and international dimension to it. At that time, I had fallen in love with astronomy, and you don't go too far into astronomy without bumping into Albert Einstein. And from Einstein, one day I was at the Denver Library in the card catalog, and I ran across a book called Einstein on Peace. And it's about a 500, 600 page biography of his wrestling with the question of why war and how to deal with war. And around page 335 of that book, he starts talking about the one group that is working on the approach to addressing war that he thinks is the only one that will work, and it's the World Federalist Movement. And that's how I became involved with WFM many years ago, and WFM became a peace movement, and its initial goal was to use the rule of law and justice and human rights and principles of constitutional federal democracy to address the issue of war and anarchy, and so it was a root cause rule of law peace organization that I joined, and that's a proper preface. And I have been honored to serve as its general secretary and executive director these last 25 years, and I am formally, I finished this last week, but I'm remaining in my position to hand over a few practical details on signing over to the new executive director, Tawanda Hondora, some of the bank and other responsibilities, but the transition is now occurring. But I am dedicated to this peace movement and to its goals, and have, as I said, been very pleased over the last 25 years. And our biggest project in that period of time, in terms of partnership with other organizations, we have about 3,000 other non-governmental organizations in 150 countries that we work with on our international justice work. And it's also financially been the project that WFM has benefited from more than any other project in our 72-year history. And we played a crucial role in the development of the Rome Statute that created an international criminal court. And it started basically in 1989 with the Caribbean countries through their Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago asking the General Assembly to take on this issue of a independent international criminal court. The General Assembly efforts had been made 2 or 3 times since the Nuremberg Tribunals and Tokyo Tribunals to start a process, but because of the end of the Cold War and other developments, the General Assembly proceeded, and in 1994 a draft statute was issued And it's at that time that WFM convened and organized the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. It was anticipated that it would take decades to negotiate, but in fact, 4 years later, we were able to have in July 17th, 1998, 120 countries voting yes, and 7 countries, including the US and China and Israel and Sudan and 4 other countries voting no. But by 120 to 7, the governments agreed to the Rome Statute. And then also it was to take 20 years or more to get governments and their parliaments to ratify this treaty. But in 2002, in April, we had 66 governments that had ratified, 11 depositing on the same day in April of 2002, and the treaty entered into force on July 1, 2002. At that time, John Bolton, who was in the Bush administration, was the architect of an effort to try and kill the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court. And there was a 3-pronged strategy by the United States in the Security Council of the United Nations, by laws in the United States, and by forcing governments to sign immunity treaties, and they have over 100 of those treaties that are in existence. And that's relevant to what we will get to, because now Mr. Bolton is the National Security Advisor, and when he had his first major speech last July, he basically indicated his goal was to continue his efforts to kill the International Criminal Court. But to get back again to the history, I think the Nuremberg Tribunals after World War II were the most fundamental first major step that has led to where we are in 2019. The Nuremberg Tribunals did result in the conviction of major leaders of the Nazi regime and their execution and imprisonment. It was followed by the Tokyo Tribunal, which was a more difficult tribunal for the United States because it would not agree to allowing crime against humanity to be discussed, because the US had ended World War II dropping atomic bombs on Nagasaki and Hiroshima, and hundreds of thousands of civilians were killed in that process. Then after 1948-49, it took, as I said, to 50 years or 40 years to 1989 for the process to begin again. Also, in the post-Cold War period in 1993 and 94, because of the civil war that broke out within the former Yugoslavia, and the genocide that occurred in Srebrenica, the Security Council, against all expectations, created the Yugoslav Tribunal. And then the next year, tragically, the Rwanda genocide occurred, and the Security Council created the Rwanda Tribunal. Also during this period of time, there was other tribunals created, some with the Security Council's blessing, like the Sierra Leone Tribunal, dealing with the West African War in Sierra Leone, Liberia, etc. And after 30-some years, a Cambodia Tribunal was a hybrid tribunal with national and international judges participating, addressing the genocide that occurred in Cambodia with the Khmer Rouge. There have been others like the Lebanese Tribunal, and I won't go into all of them. At the same time, in the last 20 years, a number of national prosecutions of these major international humanitarian law crimes, which are primarily war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, those crimes that are part of the Geneva Conventions, the torture conventions, other mass atrocity prevention international treaties. But in South America, a number of trials, mainly against their own nationals in Argentina and Chile and Peru. Mexico extradited former generals to South American countries. There were a number of trials in Canada of former Pakistan and Bangladesh accused, and there were trials of the Rwandans that fled to Europe in about 10 or 12 countries in Europe and Canada, etc. So the last 25 years has been the most significant development of the rule of law and justice being enforced by the international community in all of history. And the International Criminal Court, which all the other tribunals were individual situations, and they were situations that were defined by a specific territorial and time frame. The International Criminal Court has jurisdictions over crimes that occur by the nationals of any country that has ratified the treaty or on the territory of any country that's ratified the treaty. And there's two other exceptions that a country can ask the court to intervene even if they haven't ratified, and then they're subject to the jurisdiction. And finally, the Security Council, under its Chapter 7 powers in the UN Charter, can ask the court to assist in maintaining peace and security by investigating and prosecuting. And they have asked the court on two occasions on the crimes committed in Darfur in the Sudan, and the crimes allegedly committed by the Gaddafi regime in Libya. So presently, but the ICC is a permanent court, so if it can't deal with issues immediately, it can deal with issues at any time from July 1st, 2002, if the crimes have occurred. A country that can come in now and ratify, as Malaysia did last week, back to 2002 if they wanted. Most countries will only make it prospective. The ICC cannot deal with any crime that occurred before 1 July 2002 in any event. It's not retroactive. The court has 11 situations, mostly in, most of them have been referred by African countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, by Uganda, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire in West Africa, etc. It has situations that the prosecutor has initiated in Kenya at the request of Kofi Annan and the commission after the post-election crimes in Kenya. It is also addressing crimes committed in Georgia, which involves the Russians, in Afghanistan, and which we'll talk to in a minute. It has also, I think, 10 preliminary examination countries where, like in the Philippines and in Colombia, where the prosecutor is looking into whether the governments are investigating or prosecuting or assisting those governments in addressing whether the crimes rise to the level of jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. The entire budget of the International Criminal Court is less than the budget of one federal office of prosecution in Boston, say, much less than one of the DC federal district courts or the New York district courts. So it is trying to deal with 20-some situations with no police force, very few investigators. There is 18 judges, and I think there's 3 judges whose terms have expired, but because they are involved in active cases are continuing to serve. They've had some, very difficult experiences with trying to arrest people, and the president of Sudan, who has been under arrest warrants since 2012, continues to travel and go to conferences, and presently the government of Jordan has appealed and said that its obligations to respect immunity of heads of governments and senior government officials makes it so that it ought to be able to allow Bashir to come to an international meeting that Jordan is hosting, whether it's an Arab League meeting or an African Union or similar type of meeting. The African Union is going to ask for an advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, probably in May, on whether the ICC can arrest a serving head of state, etc. So the issues of controversy surrounding the court are enormous. The one last point I would make before I'd be happy to deal with some questions or ask or provide more information, is this fascinating book called The Internationalist, which was produced by 2 Yale lawyers, legal professors. And it demonstrates something that I think diplomats, academics, and even NGOs have not paid enough attention to, and that's the synergy that exists between international treaties and treaty regimes, etc. So the Internationalist was making the argument, this book, that a much criticized and little publicized treaty in 1927, the Paris Peace Pact, which called after the World War I for the renunciation of war, but which was signed by 1931 or 32 by 34 countries or so, almost all of the countries that had participated in Versailles, but which by 1940, almost all of those countries were at war. And so it was largely thought of as a failure, but it was the basis upon which the prosecutor of the Nuremberg Tribunals based that tribunal's ability to say that individuals could be charged with war crimes, not just states. And so individual responsibility of heads of governments, generals, or for that matter, militia or rebel leaders, etc., was fully established. And I think that issue of individual responsibility has been accepted. It also had the impact that there have been only a few acts of aggression where a country has occupied another country since the end of World War II. I think 3 or 4 in the last 74 years. And that is, whereas before 1945, a country had the likelihood that it would be invaded twice in a person's lifetime. Now it's down to 1 in 1,000 years or something on the basis of the last 70 years. So it's an extraordinary development. It's had all sorts of implications. Of course, we have 193 nations now recognized by the UN, and 6 or 7 countries are entities that would like to be recognized as independent countries. But the rule of law has progressed enormously, and of course also in the fields of the World Bank, international trade, international finance, aviation, law of the sea, etc. So that the knee-jerk view that international law doesn't work and is just simply a tool of the big powers that they obey when it's in their interest, and or they enforce when it's in their interest and ignore when it's not in their interest, is a much too superficial conclusion about the rule of law. But Nancy, let me go ahead and open it up for any comments or questions that any of the members of this wonderful conference call might have.
Yes, well, let me mention first of all that you may have two screens set up. You're looking straight at me. Prior, you were looking to the left. I don't know if you have two screens or not, but this is a good shot right now.
Okay.
You did allude to our dear John Bolton, and I thought I might ask you to say a little bit about the current status of the U.S. and the ICC.
Very good. Well, one of the requests is that the prosecutor has made is to have a pretrial chamber authorize the office of the prosecutor to proceed with an investigation of crimes committed in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a state party, but they have not asked the court to come in and investigate. So the prosecutor, out of caution, has asked the judges to approve her intention. And that would be, of course, the Taliban, ISIS, it would be some of the other, perhaps Pakistan or government crimes that have occurred. But one of the most controversial is in 2003, the United States created a number of called black sites where individuals who they believed were part of the war on terror against the United States were apprehended, and then they were transferred to sites where they were tortured, and that includes state parties of their own statute, such as Latvia, Poland, and Romania, and I think some of the other countries, Australia, UK, and them are very worried about the prosecution proceeding, and that was what Bolton made his strong statement last summer, saying that if the judges and the prosecutor proceed against U.S. nationals, he will threaten to arrest them and prosecute them if they come to the United States, sanction them, seize their finances, and in addition that he would go after any other country that helped and any company. And of course, NGOs are nonprofit corporations, so it was a very dangerous threat, and one in which we still don't know what the Trump administration will do should the judges approve and the prosecutor proceed in this. Now, the U.S. will say that it has dealt with it, but of course the U.S. Senate does not agree, and so the Democrats in the U.S. Senate actually released the report that they received on these black sites and the torture that occurred. And so there is, and also these are crimes that were not approved at a mid-level or low level, but these were actions that took place at the highest levels of the U.S. government. And so high-level officials in the United States would be potentially subjected to arrest warrants, etc., if this were to go forward. And we had anticipated that this decision by the judges would have come out last summer, but because of changes in the chambers, it hasn't. But it may be coming out soon, and others predict that maybe the prosecutor and the judges are taking the threats from the United States administration and are postponing authorizing this investigation. But I expect that it will be announced in the next number of weeks, one way or the other.
Thank you. Okay, I am going to unmute everyone. And Gail, I see your hand, so I'll let you go ahead and offer your. Oh, except now should be on. Yeah, there you go. You're unmuted.
I'm glad you asked about the black sites, because you paint a very rosy picture of the International Criminal Court. But well, Christopher Fluge, a German judge at the International Criminal Court, resigned because of interference with that particular thing, where the ICC was essentially intimidated into not addressing charges that the US engaged in torture in Afghanistan. And one could look around the world and say, well, what are the worst human rights violations? And, you know, if I were to pick one person that I would think would be the most likely to, you know, should be charged, it would be Elliot Abrams, who was involved in war in Latin America. And yet, so I'm wondering what ideas you have, and also there's been charges of intimidation. You know, Fluge said that judges were threatened, actually, and so did Christopher Black, and so did Peter Erlander, that there was interference by the US in the proceedings of the, well, specifically the special tribunals. So, I mean, we're a group that we realize that there are problems in the UN, and we're looking for ways to change things so that things will be more fair and efficient and effective. And I'm wondering what ideas you have to cut down the interference by the big powers in the International Criminal Court and its subsidiaries.
Okay. Well, let me answer a couple of questions fairly quickly as best I can. One, the crimes that Elliot Abrams and others, top officials of the US government, were actually not only accused, but even some of them convicted of, including Abrams, occurred in the 1980s, and these would not be subject to the International Criminal Court's jurisdiction, which will not cover anything that happened after before 1 July 2002, or when a country ratifies the crimes on their territory before the date that they ratify. And so for Malaysia, we ratified last week. Unless they specify that they accept jurisdiction back to 2002, they would be only addressing crimes after that. This Christian Fluge, if I understand, it has been completely misreported around the world. That was not an ICC judge. He didn't resign from the ICC. He resigned from the MIT, which is the continuation mechanism of the Yugoslav and Rwanda tribunals. He resigned because Turkey has arrested a judge on that tribunal. The regime and the Secretary General of the UN refused to tell Turkey you cannot, and then Turkey insisted on appointing another person to this judge's position. This was why the German judge and others have resigned from the continuation of the Rwandan and Yugoslav mechanism. And yes, I think there is the danger of, you know, right, we last year in 2017, the Assembly of State Parties agreed to add new jurisdictions. The one that is the most controversial was the jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. It has much less strength in enforcement than war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, but countries that ratify the amendment on aggression couldn't proceed with that and ask the court to assist them. And of course, I think there's only been aggression committed by 3 countries in the last 20 years that is widely recognized: the United States and the United Kingdom in Iraq, and Russia in the Crimea and Ukraine and Georgia. And so you have 3 of the veto members and permanent members of the security that are subject to this jurisdiction, and will be, I think, fierce opponents of moving forward. But one hopes that in the United States, for example, the institutions of justice and rule of law and human rights will eventually convince the United States that they need to be part of this system of international criminal justice and not an opponent of it.
Bill, I know you had indicated you could join us for 30 minutes, and it's been about that. Are you willing to take a few more questions? How is that for you?
No, let's take 10 or 15 more minutes if you want.
Thank you so much. Okay, Bob.
Yeah, I had two questions. The first is a follow-up on Nancy's question about Bolton. I don't remember if Bolton himself said this, or maybe it was Bush, and I'm just wondering if you could help me kind of place it, that somebody, again, it could have been Bolton, in their threats toward the ICC, of what they would do if the ICC went after any Americans, someone said, "We will also invade The Hague," which seemed to me, I don't know if it was just bluster or they were actually thinking that. But did you hear that? And do you know, who said that and when?
Well, yeah, no, this is the American Servicemembers Protection Act, which was adopted in 2002, 3, and 4, but mainly it's 2002 and 3. And it has been characterized, by the Dutch as the Hague Invasion Act, because it does say that if a U.S. national is transferred to The Hague, which is the location of the International Criminal Court, the U.S. Military is authorized to invade and liberate that individual. Of course, it would be in violation of NATO and all sorts of other things. So, unfortunately, there are an awful lot of laws that have occurred at the time after 9/11 in the United States that I think were very much the whole establishment on the war against terrorism, as opposed to just enforcing international humanitarian and human rights law and others, which would have been, I think, a much more effective way than the so-called war on terrorism has been. I think the war on terrorism is the same impact that the war on drugs has been, and one hopes that going forward, governments, and including the United States and others, will adopt more effective, non-military based, regime change, interfering with other countries' elections, etc., based efforts.
Yeah, thank you. If I could just throw in my second question, that the main criticism that I've heard about the ICC is that it's essentially just a tool of the major powers, and that they just go after black African warlords, and don't touch anyone else. However, more recently, I've heard that other folks from other parts of the world and other colors of skin are in the pipeline, and they're actually expanding beyond black African warlords. So can you speak to that? What other kinds of situations is the ICC now putting their focus on?
Well, it is true that when the governments agreed in 1998, one of the I think major influences was at the same time that Africa was moving from the Organizations of African Unity to an African charter that created the African Union because of the Rwanda failure. And they adopted in the African Union charter that heads of governments and generals and others could not hide behind sovereignty when these kinds of crimes are occurring. This was also, I think, crucially the time when Nelson Mandela had become out of prison and was the president of South Africa, and South Africa adopted one of the most progressive federal constitutions in the history, and it remains a very strong constitution. by 10 years later, the influence of Mandela has changed. The heads of states that agreed to the Rome Statute in 1998 had changed their minds, especially ones where they were in fear of being accused of crimes, whether it was in Democratic Republic of Congo or Cote d'Ivoire or Kenya or South Africa or certainly non-state parties like Zimbabwe, Sudan, the list, Chad, I could go on, etc. But most of the African governments have not gone along with this line that the ICC is just a neo-colonialist institution, etc. It certainly has never been the tool of the big powers. The big powers, the US, Russia, and China, have wanted to kill it from the beginning, basically.
Yeah, we haven't signed the ICC.
That's right.
We're not in it.
It is a court that was established by 110 of the small and middle power democracies of the world, and another 10 or 20 countries that are emerging democracies. They're the ones that took the leadership. That's the group of countries actually that are responsible for almost all of the major achievements of the last 25 years, whether it's the World Conferences of the 90s, the creation of a High Commissioner for Human Rights, the reform of peace architecture, the Paris Agreement on climate change, the 2015-2030 Sustainable Development Goals, Peace Building Commission, responsibility to protect the Rome Statute for the ICC. All of these were not led by big powers, they were led by the small and middle power democracies. And that's my hope, that the rule of law will continue to advance that way. And of course, they are also the countries that I think are trying to react to the failures in the international financial system of the crash 10 years ago in 2007, 8, and 9. And I still expect that things like the European Union and other entities are going to be willing to try and create regulations at the global level that can prevent the kind of anarchy and crash that occurred there. So.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands. I've had to mute a few people because there was a lot of background noise. Gail, okay, I'm going to call on Larry simply because Gail did ask a question before. Sorry. I know we would love to talk to you for a long time, Bill. Larry.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Bill.
Hi.
I'm curious, what is your assessment of the current support in the U.S. For the ICC? How has the coalition evolved since it started?
Well, I think it has not been, I don't think hardly any foreign affairs issues like this, law of the sea issues, other issues, to some degree climate change in the last 1 or 2 or 3 elections. But I think since the 90s, most U.S. national elections, whether it's for president or for Congress, Senate, etc., are dominated by local domestic issues, not international issues. So it's very hard to know. We probably have the least educated Congress in my lifetime about these issues. So that part is very worrisome. If the court authorizes and the court and prosecutor goes after senior U.S. government officials, and that would be CIA, NSA, Rumsfeld, and Cheney, at least, those types of individuals for the torture sites, then I'm not going to be surprised if the Democrats don't join the Republicans in trying to stop the court going forward. So I'm not optimistic, but I think the main hope we have of trying to prevent World War III by this country or others is the rule of law. So I'm always hopeful that will occur. And And I'm hoping that the 2020 election will be one where issues that haven't been discussed will be discussed at a level that is unprecedented in the last 30 or 40 or 50 years. So I should have mentioned too that one of the other areas is that Palestine has ratified the statute and has asked the court to come in and investigate, and therefore you have this very controversial issue of the court proceeding with an investigation that would include crimes committed both by Palestinians and Israelis in Gaza, in the West Bank, and in Israel. So.
Bill, maybe a follow-up, and maybe this is to wrap up, follow-up to what Larry was saying. It happens that this month everyone on the call is from the US. That's not always true. We've been having people call in from other places. But is there anything we as citizens, or we as members of Citizens for Global Solutions or other organizations can do that would be effective in supporting the ICC? I will be sharing with the book club some different sites. For instance, we can sign up for the Global Justice Weekly to get weekly reports on the status. So there are ways we can stay informed. But are there anything you recommend in terms of us as an organizational member or an individual to support international rule of law?
Well, the main way that we are going to succeed in ending impunity for these worst crimes in international law, including those actions that lead governments to civil war and international war, is getting national institutions to do the enforcement. So the more citizens in the United States insist that their government, if they did authorize international humanitarian law crimes to occur in trying to wage the war against terror, then that would be it. And so that can be a prosecutor at the provincial level or a prosecutor at the federal level. Now, whether someone proceeded with a prosecution at the state level as opposed to the federal level would be stopped by the Attorney General or stopped by the Supreme Court, I don't know. But the most important thing is for the crimes to be prosecuted and investigated at the most local level possible. That's how the system ultimately will work. The International Criminal Court can mainly only deal with those areas where there is a failed state, where there are institutions, or where the leaders of the country are actually the ones perpetrating the crimes and would never allow themselves to be investigated or prosecuted. I hope the United States is still not one of those countries, but anytime that you have criticized activities of military and intelligence in this country, only one or two times in our last 60, 70 years, at the time after the Nixon resignation, there was the church hearings, and one or two other times on Iran-Contra, etc. But hardly ever has there been willingness by U.S. institutions to challenge the military legal system's failure to investigate and prosecute. Anyway,
Thank you.
well, very, very much. I've appreciated the opportunity to talk with you. I wished I could say I would be very interested to get the same briefing on Joe's Chapter 7 book. It's been a couple of years since I read it, but I would love to follow up on it, and I hope we can continue to work together.